So I think I'm going to annoy a lot of people in a lot of camps with this analogy, but hear me out. So what do you think science, religion, and direct observation all agree with, but most people don't?
Several things. The beautiful taste of chocolate ice cream, the beauty of a sun setting over the ocean, lots of things. But I feel like you're getting to something more important than the flavor of ice cream.
So I'll give you a clue. So science has this idea of cause and effect. Essentially means that, for every effect that happens, there's this set of things which happened before it, which led to that effect happening, causes. And in science, this is called determinism. This idea that given the state of the universe and the laws of physics, we can then predict the next state of the universe. In religion, there's usually some kind of omnipotent God or being that can see the future and all futures of everyone in the universe. And in some sense, that's the same idea, right? Basically saying that this is God can see the state of the universe and knows the laws of it and can see what's going to happen next. Very similar to determinism in science. And direct observation, what I mean by that is people usually, whether right or wrong, tend to trust what they see in the world more than anything else. And maybe the best way to explain this is a little thought experiment, which I borrowed from Sam Harris. So pick a movie.
Any
Do you
movie?
have one any movie? Do you have one in mind?
I do.
How many movies do you think you could have picked from? Was it all the movies in the world? What do you think the set of options were?
It's all the movies that I'm somehow aware of. So things that I've seen, things that I've read about or heard about. So it's definitely not all the movies that have ever existed.
Yeah,
It's a pretty big number, hundreds, thousands, a large number of movies.
yeah, makes sense. Big movie fan. I reckon I've got a few hundred. Okay, so you picked out of the set a few hundred movies. Did the one you picked just come to mind immediately, or did a few options flash into your head beforehand? What was that process like?
Several options flashed into my mind, and specifically images from the movies, people's faces, particular scenes that I found memorable. And then I just ended up sort of choosing one of those.
So let's say we started off with a pool of 1,000 options. I asked the question, a few options came to mind. Do you think you could have picked anything other than from the set of options which jumped into your mind? Let's say 5 movies jumped into your mind. Do you think you could have picked any of the other 995?
There were actually 8 movies that jumped into my mind, and they were all of the Harry Potter series. Harry Potter 1, 2, 3 to 7B. And I chose number 6. Could I have chosen something that did not pop into my mind? I think the answer there is obviously no. But if I spent more time thinking about it, definitely more movies would have popped into my mind than the 8 Harry Potter movies.
Okay, cool. For the sake of this experiment, let's imagine we didn't give you more time to come up with more movie options. So already something where you thought you had 1,000, maybe more choices, is actually a far more constrained choice than you thought it was. We've gone from 1,000 down to really, you could have only ever picked from 8. And now really the interesting question is, what made you pick that 6th movie, right? If you had 8 movies in your mind and some thought came into your mind, that's the one I'm going to pick. Where did that thought come from? Did you initiate that thought?
It feels a little bit mysterious, to be honest. You said the word movie and images started to flash up in my mind. And there was some kind of conversation I had with myself about which one is the right one to choose. But then before I know it, I had chosen Harry Potter 6 and those words were falling out of my mouth. So to be honest, it's a little bit mysterious.
Yeah. This is for anyone who meditates, this is probably not an unfamiliar experience. You'll begin to notice that thoughts just pop into your consciousness and they don't really have anything preceding them. And when you see this happen in art, you start to wonder when the thought for me to make a choice or take an action pops up, it almost feels like you didn't make that choice because there's part of you watching that choice just pop up out of nowhere and you then go and make it. And if we go back, science, religion, direct observation, what all of them seem to agree on is that the next thing we do or the next state of the universe does seem to be determined by the previous state. And in a world where that is true and that happens, are the choices we're making really choices. They feel like choices. We experience some sense of autonomy and being able to choose ourselves from multiple options. But are they in fact just really driven by the previous state of the world and the laws of physics and, inevitable that we would make that choice ultimately?
That's an interesting way of seeing it. So just to play back to make sure I understand what you're saying, from a scientific perspective, there is this idea that causes precede effects. And so anything that happens is fully determined in some way by all the things that came before it. And so in that sense, there's no sort of like freedom, there's no wiggle room there. In the religious context, you're saying that there is an idea of an all-seeing super being who already sees the future and knows what's going to happen. And so if that being knows what's going to happen, there can't be any wiggle room in that because it would deviate from what the person knows. And the third thing you're saying is, even if we look at our direct observation, if we sort of look at it clearly enough, it doesn't feel like we are the conscious arbiters of those micro decisions, like picking a movie. And I think if that's true, kind of anything else as well, because everything is basically decisions like picking movies. And so in all those circumstances, what you're saying is, doesn't really seem like we as conscious agents can make free choices about what happens now and then in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And I said at the beginning, it's going to annoy a lot of people in a lot of camps. There's obviously exceptions and edge cases here. Some of the scientists are going to talk about quantum mechanics, and some of the religious people are going to point out religions where there are exceptions. But I think as a whole, exactly as you put it. And secondly, people tend to reject the idea, which is very interesting when so many broad encompassing schools of thought all seem to point in the same direction.
For sure. And just to couch that quantum mechanics point, I have 2 degrees in physics and I've read a lot about this. And so I would love to get into the quantum mechanics point because I have views. But let's then get into the discussion. I take it what we're trying to discuss today, what we are discussing today, more than just trying, is this topic of free will and what it is and why it's important. Is that what you want to dig in today?
Yeah, exactly.
Let's do it. Maybe let's just give a definition so we're all on the same page here. How do you think about free will? What is this concept of free will? What do people mean when they use that word?
So I think what people mean when they say it is the sense of having multiple options in any given scenario, and the feeling, and maybe more than the feeling, the actual genuine ability to choose between those options yourself, being an autonomous agent who, independently of any other force is making that.
So we're saying I made some choices yesterday, the day before, and if we were to wind back the clock and I was posed with those choices again, I could have chosen something different and that would have been fully in my control. That really could have happened.
Yeah.
And then separately to that, you're saying I also have the deeply embedded sense and feeling that I could have done that. So whether or not I actually can, I also feel that I can. So why does this topic feel so paradoxical? Like why do people get so heated and contest this idea of whether or not we have free will? Because if I play it back to the things you said at the beginning, in physics, you're fully right. There is this deeply held theory that everything in the future is determined by what comes in the past. And there's several other angles that we can look at this thing. If that's the case, why does it feel so weird and paradoxical to people?
There's probably a few reasons. I think emotionally, the idea of loss of agency or control is probably not comfortable. The same reason people don't like being told exactly what to do, micromanaged, being trapped. I think the feeling of autonomy and control is quite important to humans. And this idea of accepting this idea essentially takes all of that away. There's also broader social implications. If you remove the idea of accountability, throw your hands up in the air and say, why am I doing anything at all? I'm just going to not do anything and let the universe decide where it takes me, which of course is, in doing that, you're also making a choice to not do something.
It's a very Taoist way of seeing the world. So maybe in that religious clue we gave at the beginning, we should exclude Taoism, because in Taoism, very much just the way of the world and things unfolding. And it's very unclear to what extent people have any conscious agency really. But I get what you're saying. It makes a lot of sense, but it feels like what we're talking about in that case is more about whether or not it's useful to believe in this concept of free will, because you mentioned things like people like to have the feeling of conscious agency. If you don't believe it, it's hard to motivate yourself to do anything. Those things are really true and good, but they feel a little bit separate from the fact of the matter. We can believe false things that are helpful, but
Yeah,
nonetheless, they remain false. So are we talking about both of those in this conversation? The one is the truth of the matter, and the other is the usefulness of believing in free will or not?
yeah, for sure. I think they're both worth touching on because this is a topic that's loaded with cognitive dissonance. Whichever conclusion you arrive at, it's actually pretty hard to shake the feeling that you do make choices. And there's definitely some usefulness in finding balance around that cognitive dissonance because you do need to be able to wake up every day and make choices and do things and feel that they are impactful and meaningful. And to some extent that you did choose them.
Yeah. I worry that this is feeling a bit abstract and it's hard to make tangible because there are lots of interesting philosophical questions that people talk about. Philosophers write books about things that no one have ever heard about. Is this important? Are there any real world examples that make it really concrete why this matters?
Yes, let's dig into first this idea of do we have control over our choices? And we can do that by looking at a few examples of where, like the movie thought experiment, in reality, we can actually see choices are, at the very least, far more constrained than we typically think they are. Whether or not they're fully determined, we can get to that later. But, one of my favorite examples is this guy who in the 60s shot up a bunch of people in the University of Texas. And his name was, I think it was Charles Whitman. Yep. And he was 25 years old. He killed 13 people, wounded 32. And he left a note before he did it. And it said, I don't really understand myself these days. I'm supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, I can't recall when it started, I've been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts. And this is a really interesting note. This person has noticed some change in his behavior to the point where he's gone and done something terrible, kill 13 people, wound 32. But he feels like something other than himself is driving him to take these actions, irrational thoughts. And what they found was they did an autopsy on his brain and they found a tumor in his brain after the shooting. I think he killed himself afterwards. And they found a tumor the diameter of a nickel. And this tumor was basically underneath a structure called the thalamus, impinging on something called the hypothalamus and compressing a region of the brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is basically your control center for fear and anger and a lot of what we typically call negative emotions. And they believe, and have very good reason to, that this tumor was the cause of his actions. If we take a step back, typically when you see instances of, crime, this kind of behavior, people are very quick to blame the person, the individual, right? They believe he had autonomy, he made choices, he made bad choices, and it was their fault that a particular thing happened. But in this case, it was actually probably the tumor's fault. In the universe where Charles Whitman never developed a tumor, would he have killed anyone? I think it seems reasonable to say not. And, not everything has to be a tumor, right? When you see somebody shoplift or, even shoot somebody without a tumor, what is driving that? Is it just a difference in their brain structure, which not a tumor, but also something not within their control, so to speak?
Yeah, I love that example. I think it's such a powerful example because in one sense, you could look at it and say, okay, yes, but this was a non-normal brain. There was a tumor there, but you could abstract one level away and you could say a tumor is just a type of brain structure and a type of brain architecture. Maybe it's a non-traditional one and it's like not a good one, not one that we want. But fundamentally speaking, what we're saying is there was some sort of structural thing that happened in this guy's brain that he didn't control. He was not the conscious arbiter of whether or not this tumor emerged. But nonetheless, something happened which caused his brain to form in a particular way. And as a downstream consequence, this tragedy happened and he ended up killing 13 people. And at that level, that same story somehow applies to everyone because none of us are the sort of the architects of our own brains down to the fundamental level. There's in some sense in which it's just tumors all the way down, right?
Yeah.
And if that's true, and the brain and what goes on there is what determines how we act and behave in the world, then it feels like we're all Charles Whitman in a sense. We're not out there killing people, but we have no choice about what architecture of our brains we have. And therefore, do we have conscious agency over the decisions that it makes? It feels like not. It's got this sort of like sense of the ground dropping out from beneath you, this story.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not an isolated example, right? They've found similar cases with other individuals, criminals. There's experiments where they've taken people and they've basically put them in an MRI machine and gotten them to make a choice where they choose, say, for example, between two buttons, a red button and a green button, but they can actually see that there's a part of the brain which in some sense makes that choice. It lights up before the conscious part of the mind thinks it's making that choice. There's something originating that thought outside of our subconscious mind, which is driving us to have the feeling of making that choice, the same way the movie pops into your mind and then you go push that button.
That reminds me of another experiment, very, very similar to that experiment, where it's not necessarily that people were in a brain scan and we could predict that a decision had been made before they were aware of it. It's almost like the reverse of that. And the experiments that I have in mind are the very famous split brain experiments, where, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'll get the terminology wrong here, but essentially the two hemispheres of the human mind are connected by some sort of structure that can be severed without killing the person. And the person can, for all intents and purposes and from all like sort of external observation, seem to function relatively normally. But what happens is by the way our body and brain are wired up, stimulus, like light, let's say, coming in from the right eye goes into the left hemisphere, and the opposite for the left eye. You show someone an image in the left eye, that information passes through to the right hemisphere. And so people with this sort of split brain damage or this like communication pathway between the two hemispheres severed, they can be shown different stimuli in different eyes. And we know then that only one hemisphere is getting each of the stimuli. For example, these people can be taken and the left eye can be blocked and they can be shown an image on their right eye or potentially a word, and vice versa for the left eye. And these things could be different. Potentially one eye gets an instruction, stand up and go get a glass of water. And the other eye can get an image of something. And what I recall is in these experiments, you might have someone sitting down and you would flash this stand up and go get a glass of water sentence or command into one eye, the eye that's not responsible for sort of language. So I think that would be probably the left eye. Info goes into the right hemisphere, decision is made, but it's the left hemisphere that explains decisions. And the person would get up and walk to the door to go get a glass of water. And then experimenters will say, what made you make that decision? Like, why are you going to do that? And the person would come back with some answer that has got nothing to do with the car. The person would say, oh, I'm thirsty. I just got a bit thirsty. I'm going to go get some water, or I need the bathroom. I'm leaving the room. And the experimenter knows that's not true because the person is just obeying the instruction that they were shown. But the person themselves is not aware that's what they're doing because the language, the rationalizing hemisphere of their brain is not the one that saw that image. And so they come out with a full description that feels like they've got conscious agency, and they explain it perfectly articulately, and to any external person, they look like a normal, perfectly functioning human, but they're wrong. They're completely wrong. They were completely ignorant of the causes of their actual action. And it reminds me of all these examples you've said. With Charles Whitman, there was a tumor. In this case, he was aware that there was something funky going on in his mind, and it made him act in a particular way. But then there are other examples in which people still feel like they've got full conscious agency, and we know that they don't. Like that example proves it. So it does feel like, sort of whatever way you look at it, we can't really have the conscious agency that we think we do.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I hadn't heard of those experiments, but it makes it makes a lot of sense. What do you think the implications of this are? Let's say we buy the theory, all right, we have no control over our actions. What am I meant to do? Do I wake up tomorrow and just stay in bed and let the universe do what it wants to me? Or how do we reconcile this with the ability to also live a meaningful life?
It's such an interesting question. In some ways, there is this like paradox or contradiction in which if you really believe that there isn't such a thing as true free will, how do I even answer that question? Because anything I think, anything I say is somehow determined, or it's not in my control. And so I don't even know where to start answering that question from that perspective.
Yeah. It's the analogy I like to use is we're just watching the movie of our own lives play out in front of us. The most immersive 3D experience you could ever get. And we just have this feeling of autonomy and control. But in reality, it's just a really immersive virtual experience.
It's a really good analogy. What it doesn't necessarily answer for me then is, if from all these different angles, it seems like this free will concept is incoherent, why is it that most people believe it? Like, why do we tend to have such a deeply held belief that we do have free will? And maybe an evolutionary perspective, why would we have evolved that sort of sensation that we are the conscious agents of our futures?
I think it's worth separating the levels of abstraction at which this question can be asked as well. Because I think most people would actually agree with the idea that the laws of physics are deterministic, they don't change. And we can definitely make pretty good predictions when we know the laws of physics and the state required to make a prediction, right? If I throw a ball in the air, given the inputs of where the ball started, how hard I'm throwing it, the angle I'm throwing it at, I can make an extremely good prediction about where that ball will land. And we can do it with far more complex systems. In theory, hypothetically, if I built a supercomputer that you gave all of the laws of physics, discovered and undiscovered, and the current state of the universe, could that computer predict the next state of the universe, where each atom would move to, given the laws of physics? And could it keep on doing that to the point where it just predicted everything into the future? Very similar to this idea of an omnipotent God. And I don't think most people would disagree with that idea. At the level of abstraction of physics and atoms and non-conscious beings, I think most people do agree with the idea of determinism. But then when we get to the level of abstraction of humanity and consciousness and choice, most people do disagree. And so I guess the question is this an issue of semantics? Does free will actually mean the feeling of free will? And is determinism something else? And do they each serve different purposes? Because to me, that's probably where the question gets confused.
That's a great observation. It's almost as you were saying that this is it a question of semantics. You could think of another concept, which maybe makes it clearer. Let's say a concept of like love or an emotion. You could say, does love exist? And of course it does. Like, people love one another. We know that to be true. It's a sort of an emergent emotion. But if you say, where is love in the laws of physics? And you're looking at some subatomic particles and the equations that dictate them, there is no concept of love there. And in that case, the paradox doesn't feel paradoxical, because we can easily say, oh, we're comfortable with the fact that the concept of love is something that emerges at a high level of abstraction, and we don't expect that concept to apply to underlying laws of physics. That's fine, and it's well understood. But the concept of free will somehow feels a bit different, because we have this idea of reductionism, which says if we break things down into component parts and understand them, we should be able to predict the behavior of the macro part, the whole. And we can keep going down and take a human and break them down into their brain and their body and everything that's going on there, and do that again into sort of the firing of neurons, and do that again into the behavior of atoms or electrons in those neurons. At that level, things are described by laws of physics. And those laws of physics, as you say, they don't have a concept of free will. Those laws of physics are potentially deterministic. There might be quantum randomness, which we can go into, but or at least we can say the laws of the physics are equations that don't have a concept of free will. What happens in the future is certainly determined by current state. And if that's true, and we just keep ratcheting up to the scale of a human, it does feel like there's no free will at any level. And so in that sense, it's different from an emergent emotion like love, because love is understood to not exist down at that level. Free will feels a little bit different. So I think potentially, like, it is a question of semantics, as you say, but I don't think that really makes the illusion vanish so much.
Yeah, I agree. And I think adjacent to this is probably also a question of the usefulness of the idea. There's usefulness to both believing that there is no free will, and that there is free will at the level, of abstraction where we are making choices every day. And so I think the ultimate resolution, which I've landed on personally, is some form of cognitive dissonance where I haven't thrown out the idea that I make choices. I still feel like I make choices and I care about them and I'm invested in them when I am forced to make a choice. But at the same time, there's a constant awareness that in reality, I'm not making the choice. And I think it could probably be quite dangerous for somebody to completely throw out the feeling that they are autonomous and making choices, because at least for me, I imagine that leading down into a path of apathy and not really doing much. So I think you're right. I think one of the reasons this becomes a harder question is because you can think about it all the way up and down the levels of abstraction, and at no level of abstraction, even in the conscious mind, when you directly observe, does it feel like you have this ability to make choices. But I think the resolution to get to here, probably what's a useful way to think about it and internalize this understanding and knowledge so that day to day you're left in a better place.
I think you're totally right. There are two sort of questions at hand here. One is the raw truth of the matter, and the other is whether or not it's useful to think in a particular way. Let's close off the raw truth of the matter and address the open questions of quantum randomness and so on, and then talk about the usefulness of the concept. I think we've already said if the laws of physics are indeed fully deterministic, everything that happens is determined by what came before it. And if we could calculate the sort of position of all particles and so on, we would know what would happen in the future. Therefore, if that's true, there is no free will. There is this question of quantum randomness, which is the idea that there is some inherent randomness or uncertainty built into the laws of physics, which means certain things are inherently probabilistic and we can't predict them. Even if we knew the laws of physics and the current state of the universe, there is certain inherent randomness in how those things evolve that would mean we would never be able to predict the future fully. I think that doesn't really give us anything extra, because even if what's going on in our brains is quantum randomness, the firing of my neurons was at its core like a random activity, that doesn't give me any agency. And so it doesn't actually answer the question of free will. Whether it was predicted in advance or it happens by the toss of some coin that I'm not in control of, that doesn't change whether or not I'm free to make the decision or to have done differently. So I think you're right. Both of those things point to no free will. And then on the level of do we experience free will, I think your example of the movie is totally right. If we look very closely and carefully, it seems like at that micro level, it's clear that what pops into our minds is not fully in our control. And so there isn't at that level a freedom of will, a freedom to have chosen differently. Thoughts come and eventually we mysteriously make a choice. So I think you're right. From the truth of the matter, the concept is incoherent. It's not the way the world works. It's not how we work. Let's move on then to the usefulness of the idea. In an evolutionary sense, a lot of the things that we believe and see and the way we interact with the world basically have evolved just for their usefulness. The fact that we see the world at a certain scale, the fact that we see the world unfolding at a particular speed, all of these are things that we've evolved to basically fulfill the whims of the process that is natural selection. And some of them are useful, some of them aren't. I take it that this free will belief needs to fall into this camp. It's some sense that we've evolved and it's serving some function. So the question is whether or not it's true, how should we think about it in order to live most effectively?
I don't have any good theories as to why we might have evolved it. I have some theories, but they're not great. So let's avoid that part of the conversation. But I think there are some very clear benefits, at least that I've found, to really internalizing this idea that the universe is deterministic. And very importantly, other people aren't determining their own actions, right? Because what that does is it's a fairly liberating feeling in the sense that someone does something bad to you, or they do something bad to anyone, you're no longer even able to blame them, right? If you truly internalize the idea that they had no choice, they're entirely a product of their experiences, whether that's genetics, whether it's the way they were brought up, whether it's something that just happened to them that day, their actions were not really in their control. You can't blame them. And that leaves you with the ability to basically withstand any amount of negative or also positive things happening, right? You can choose where you invest emotionally. And it's the same thing with things that happen to yourself, right? You can separate yourself from the outcomes, at least, of your own actions, because you were never the one who determined how the universe was going to react to them and also even what they were in the first place. It allows you to independently watch the movie and enjoy it to the level of actually watching a movie, probably a little bit more. You're more invested in the characters, but it's the same reason why when you watch a movie and somebody gets shot, you're not, you wouldn't be losing your mind as much as if it had happened really in front of you.
It makes a lot of sense. There's several threads to pull on there, but there's one macro sense in which this whole idea of even in trying to internalize something and realizing benefits or even negative consequences, I still really struggle with the fact that in the case of not being free, do I even have, I don't have a choice as to whether or not to internalize them. I don't have a choice as to how I respond to somebody doing something that's bad. As you say, if you don't believe in free will, when somebody does something that we would deem bad, we need to give up this deeply held sense of blame because we understand that at its core, they were not responsible in some sense. And we should get into that because I think that's got very practical implications. But in that context, I'm not free to choose how I feel about them. I'm not free to choose whether I blame them. I'm not free to choose whether or not I believe in the concept of free will or not. And so I do find it quite difficult to make sense of this whole notion of internalizing the idea of free will and giving up blame because I'm not the person who makes the choices.
Yeah. One way to think about it is, for somebody listening, you just happen to be listening to this particular conversation at some point in time, and the series of sounds which are coming out of our mouths and now into your ears, making your brain respond in such a way where maybe it internalizes it and maybe it doesn't. But if it does happen to internalize it in the future now, you're going to respond to the world in such a way that is better for your emotional state. Next time you see somebody do something, you're not going to blame them for whatever they did. And I think if you view it that way, it's to some extent just luck. You were in the right place at the right time and you heard the right words, and now your brain state is a little bit different. And once you internalize it a little bit for the next 10, 20, 30 years, that set of neural pathways will reinforce and it'll become more deeply internalized and you'll hopefully become a happier person. But like you said, the internalization is not really a choice you're making. You just happen to be in the right place at the right time. And I think one of the ways to think about this idea of choice and how you can change, I guess, the future path which you end up on. And again, you're not really changing it, but you have more, and this is very tenuous because you don't actually have control again, but you have more control over what happens over a 10, 20, 30-year period to your mind than you do over the short term, right? In the short term, your mind is likely to react very quickly based on what is pre-programmed. But over a long period of time, you can probably change the structure of your mind to respond to external stimuli in different ways. And that's largely the effect of giving it the right inputs so that it, again, outside of your control, begins to shape into the right thing.
That makes sense. It's a bit hard to think about, but it does make sense. What worries me is that so much of the way society functions seems to depend on us having this notion of free will and conscious agency. And so you've mentioned several sort of benefits there. If you give up the notion of free will, there's less blame that can be given. The concept of hatred doesn't make sense because what can you hate someone for if they didn't have a choice over what they did? And self-blame and self-hatred as well. You're totally right. If I, at the core, don't have full control over who I am and what I do, I should cut myself some slack because there's a limit to how much good I could do. But on the other hand, so much of society depends on this idea of people being responsible for their actions. Responsibility, accountability for what you do is the foundation of all of ethics and all of morality. It's the foundation of our legal system. To what extent can punishment, the prison system, make sense for somebody who doesn't have control over what they do? Would it be the same as like imprisoning babies for crying? If babies don't have control of what they do, they don't have an understanding of what parents want them to do, and so they cry. In that context, it clearly wouldn't make any sense to imprison them. We're basically saying adults are the same. We're saying adults, they can have an understanding of the societal norms, but whether or not they choose to conform, at the end of the day, is not their choice. And yet we're putting people in prison and so on. So what does this mean for the justice system?
Yeah, I really like this one because I think there's two ways you can think about the justice system. And I think the way a lot of people think about it now is we put people in prison to punish them. But what's probably more productive is we put people away to minimize the harm they might do to other people. And the way you improve overall outcomes is at a systemic level, right? How do we stop the series of events which lead to people ending up becoming what we call criminals when they grow up, right? Whether that's growing up in violent households, whether that's growing up in poverty, lack of education. There are all these different factors that correlate with somebody committing a crime when they get older, right? A lot of the ones I just mentioned, a lot of them even have a strong genetic component to them. And so we can get to the point where, given the right set of factors, you could predict that somebody with 60, 70, 80%, not 100% certainty, a reasonable chance, is likely to commit a crime as an adult. And if we can make that prediction, we should really be focusing on all of the factors which led us to be able to predict that could happen. Again, poverty, untreated mental disorders, whatever it might be, instead of focusing on how do we punish the individual. And I think there's a bit more of an acknowledgement of this over the last however many 10, 20 years. A really interesting one I like is that I think in the 1800s, when somebody had an epileptic fit, it was quite scary. They'd be on the ground, their eyes would roll into the back of their head, they'd be twitching, and people would think they were possessed by a demon and burn them, which terrible outcome, right? Double bad luck. You've got epilepsy and people think you're possessed now and they're just going to burn you. And the problem with that is obviously it was a disease that was outside of their control. They didn't really do anything wrong. And eventually people realized that was the case and they started treating them and figuring out how do we prevent you having an epileptic fit. And I think we've seen that happen with a whole bunch of different population segments. Initially, when people were found out to be homosexual, it was classified as a disorder. Alan Turing was basically chemically castrated and then sadly went on to kill himself. But the mindset over time shifted from this isn't a disorder, it's something outside of their control. They end up a particular way, and we should really be focusing on how to support them and minimize the harm around it.
I think that's totally true. That's totally true. As you were speaking in the context of the justice system, what came to mind was that currently, the way we think about it is there's several different functions of, let's say, punishment, let's say imprisonment. On the one hand, you've got protecting the rest of society from someone who's potentially dangerous. Then you've also got the chance to reform somebody who's done something wrong. And then currently we also have this idea of retributive justice. So basically justified vengeance, punishing someone for the pure sake of them deserving it. And when I look at both of those in the context of there is free will and there is not free will, what I actually find is that only the last one really vanishes. You still want to protect society from dangerous people. And so it still makes sense to sort of remove them. You still want to give people the chance to reform and become better. But the concept of punishing just for the sake of hatred, that they deserve it, suddenly doesn't make sense. And I think that really does change, as you said, the approach to how the legal system is implemented. It feels like you only give up those sort of hateful, bad aspects of it and are actually much more liberated to focus on reform, retribution, prevention. And in that sense, I think it could be potentially a really helpful thing to give up this notion of agency and free will and then focus on prevention, understanding, reform.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we've been talking a lot about the downside cases of this, where negative things which you or somebody do outside your control and therefore you shouldn't be blamed. But it actually works the other way around. If we take Jeff Bezos, is his success truly his? Regardless of what you put it down to, whether he genuinely is a genius or whether he, over the course of his life, made the right decisions. The genius is potentially genetically determined. It's not something he himself did. He just happened to be born in the right place at the right time. And each of the choices he made along the course of his life also led to him ending up in some position, but he wasn't really the originator of any of those thoughts or decisions himself. And I think this does two things. I think one is, as an individual, it keeps you humble and you're almost able to just constantly be grateful because everything is really luck outside of your control. But then secondly, it makes it easier to stop playing the comparing game because it's well known humans will very quickly adjust to whatever milestones they achieve and then look at the person one step ahead. But in a world where nobody's success or failure is really their own, you can just be content with where you are.
I agree. Philosophically, and that makes total sense. One maybe concern or worry I have, or something that I think about, is that it's one thing to be exposed to information about, in this case, free will, and then make the decision yourself as to which side of the coin you land on, how you think about it. There is almost a separate question then of, armed with that, do you choose to spread that story? Is it useful for other people to think the same way that you do? You could be exposed to unhelpful truths in life, and you might choose not to talk about them because you think that on balance of probabilities and all of that, the consequences are potentially negative. And in this case, we've talked about many potential positive consequences of understanding this concept and internalizing it. I think obviously there would be some potentially negative ones, which we should talk about. And then there's an empirical question, which is, if we were to run the experiment of taking people who had never heard about this no free will concept before and exposing them to all the information required for them to fully believe and internalize that there is no free will, what happens to their life outcomes? Do they improve? Do they get worse? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet. I have seen potentially some concerning studies on correlations between the no free will belief and negative life outcomes. So I haven't looked into this super deeply, but there's several studies, most of them fairly small, US based, but these correlational studies have found things like a stronger belief in free will is correlated with better work performance, higher academic achievement, less cheating behavior, and so on. And we can reference some of these in the notes. And then on the flip side of that, the non-belief in free will, so people who don't believe in free will, that is also correlated with potentially some negative things. People feeling like they don't have self-control, they don't have agency, sitting around achieving less. And so from that perspective, whether or not it's true, there is a moral question that we have and everyone has as to, do I tell people about this? Do I tell my kids about this? So people argue about whether they should teach their kids that Santa Claus is real as a child. That's an untrue thing, but many people think it has some benefits. And this might be one of those cases that you don't necessarily tell kids that the universe is going to end, that the sun is going to explode, that grandma is going to die before they're ready. Should people be spreading this truth about no free will?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one, in my experience, people tend to, on first hearing it, oppose it quite passionately, especially if all of the ideas are new, because it does challenge a pretty core part of most people's identity. My achievements are my own, my choices are my own. Without that, what do you really have left in the way of kind of purpose and meaning? It reminds me of, if you've seen The Matrix, there's obviously, for those who haven't seen it, it's a bunch of people in a computer simulation in the future. And there's some people who realize they're in a simulation and they're fighting to get out. But there's actually one person who, I think he actually ends up sabotaging everyone else and saying, ignorance is bliss. I want to live in the Matrix. I don't care if it's real or not. And if it ends up being net positive for the individual's happiness, is that potentially the better thing to do? Is that the outcome we're optimizing for anyway?
Something to ponder. It's something to ponder. I think on balance of my experience as well and everything we talked about today, I tend to agree with you that in this case, ignorance is not bliss. It may be superficially bliss, but when you start living a more examined life and looking a bit closer at the nature of your life and your experience, it is actually quite liberating to give up this concept of free will. And it's also probably good just in a sense of training the muscle to be more open to truth and rationality and eliminate cognitive dissonance. There are people who walk around with the idea of determinism in their head and like a strong belief in that, and incompatible belief really with the notion of free will. And I think there are consequences to being that type of person, to having that type of mind that is okay with withholding incompatible ideas and holding them quite deeply. And I think even outside of the specific consequences of this belief, I think having the type of mind that can be more open to things, that can eliminate cognitive dissonance and get to a place where you can see the world more clearly, I think that really is the sort of the golden rule here. And even if in this particular case, there are some downsides to sharing this belief, taking it on, even in that case, I would probably wager that it's still worth doing.
I think you summed it up perfectly. Shall we call it there?
Let's call it there. Let's call it there.